Well, good morning everybody. Kia ora koutou katoa. I've pressed the start button and I hope that's worked. And I'd like to welcome you all very much to this webinar, which is called Apprenticeships Across the Ditch. I think we've got all the tools here. The Q&A function is going. You can use that. The chat's enabled. You can't turn on your camera or your microphone, but if you really want to later, you can put your hand up and we might be able to sort that out for you. I think there's closed captions. If anybody on the line struggles with the Australian accent, you can turn that on and you should be able to read along as we go. Look, it's a real pleasure to welcome my two expert guests. My name's Josh Williams. I'm from Skills Group and the Country Network Coordinator for Global Apprenticeship Network in New Zealand. For those that don't know, Skills Group operates Skills Institute and Skills Trades Training, which is two of New Zealand's largest vocational education providers. We operate out of 15 sites across New Zealand, offering work-based and provider-based education, supporting over 5,000 apprentices in that mix. Today, we are looking across the Tasman, all that way. Australia's apprenticeship and traineeship system, like ours, has deep historical roots and is also, like ours, navigating some real pressures, completion rates, employer costs, candidate attraction, the role of incentives, commencements, and the question of how to grow work-based learning into new occupations and higher qualifications levels. We are going to try and touch on all of those things in the next hour. So without any further ado, let me introduce our two experts joining us from Australia. Now, look, you might notice, and we certainly have noticed, there is a bit of a resemblance here. You're possibly looking at three interchangeable people with glasses, but I know Peter and Gary have got hats at the ready. And if anybody is wondering about the lack of diversity on the call, we have Melissa backstage. So there's Melissa. Thank you. Hello. She's helping us out today. And as I say, we used to all talk about diversity of thought, but now we're all asking Claude for the answers to everything. So look, we can't help how we look, but we are here to try and address some of the important issues. Thank you, Peter. There you go. That helps. Turning to Gary first. Gary Workman is Executive Director of the Apprentice Employment Network Victoria, State of Victoria, which is one of the state-based associations for group training organisations. I'm sure we'll touch on group training. Gary also hosts the country network for the GAN Global Apprenticeship Network in Australia, so is my counterpart in that regard. GAN Australia has recently released a report and an online tool modelling the return on investment for apprenticeships for employers, individuals, government, wider community. So Gary's going to talk to us in a bit about what those new numbers are saying, what we might be able to learn in New Zealand, and also potentially how we could use the tool over here and repeat the exercise. So welcome, Gary.
Morning.
Peter Canavan. Peter is the Senior Policy Officer at Australian Industry Group's Centre for Education and Training. So that's the AI group, and it's called the CET, the Centre for Education and Training. Peter is, everywhere I go when I've been over, is an undisputed guru of Australia's VET system and a senior figure at the CET. The CET delivers a significant research program, build capability and quality in the Australian vet sector. Today, Peter's going to focus us on one of my favourite reads from last year, which was called Apprenticeships and Traineeships, the Employer Perspective. That drew on a national employer survey and interviews to surface the economic realities employers face. So we'll hear from Peter what employers are saying and therefore how we might want to steer the learning model that ultimately and utterly depends on those employers. So welcome to you, Peter.
Thanks, Josh. Good morning, everyone.
Cool. Now, look, I promised to stop talking any second because this is very much about our Australian friends today. And I got accused of having a soapbox this morning, Lindsay John, so I hope you're out there and enjoy the recording later. So anyway, I'm going to just do a really quick side-by-side state of play on the current state of the apprenticeships and traineeships in New Zealand and Australia as at right now, or as best as we can get, which is about December of 2025, so the end of last year. Now, frustratingly, for any of you out there in the research space, of course, our data sets split things slightly different. Australia talks about trades and non-trades. New Zealand puts its data into apprenticeships and traineeships. So, but combining them all together, we're going for good as, good as perfect is the enemy of good, or something like that. So, good news, New Zealand, 3.7% of the employed workforce are in traineeships or apprenticeships. That compares with 2.1% of the employed workforce in Australia. We have 108,000 traineeships and apprenticeships in New Zealand out of our 2.9 million workforce. Australia, 307,000 out of its 14.7 million employed workforce. So, good news, well done, New Zealand, but let me hasten to add, we used to be 5.4% not so very long ago, and we'll get there. Age profile. This has got a couple of interesting things that I'd be, keen for us to touch on. You guys are younger than us, so when we look at our traineeships and apprenticeships together, we're pushing age of 30 as the average. The apprentices are slightly younger than the trainees, but that is the average. 27% of our new entrants, and on Australian side, the commencements, 27% of ours are school leavers and that under 19 years of age, whereas over in Australia, it's over half, 51%. So you're getting way more of your young people or that school leaver cohort coming straight into the training system. I think that's really interesting. Is it your school-based apprenticeships? We'll talk about it. And as I say, there's also a mature entrance, and as you can see from the graph, these are all ages situations in terms of the availability of traineeships and apprenticeships in both places. Just moving to gender, male and female. New Zealand, we're certainly pleased to see the good news that after a long time of the stats staying completely static, that the proportion of women in trades, women in traineeships and apprenticeships broadly, but specifically it is growing in those traditionally male trades areas after a long time of not. So as I say, we look slightly more female than the Australian set. If you combine it all, we're 39% female, whereas Australia's 35% female. Again, these are the new entrants into the system and the commencements. What we're seeing here in New Zealand, and I think it's the case in Australia, is the new entrants are more female than the overall in training, which suggests that the trend is rising. Now look, next couple of graphs are a bit scary, so I hope you're sitting down or can grab onto the table or grit your teeth or hold your breath. Because what you can see, I think, on both sides of this screen is a similar but different story. So in 2020, we had COVID-19. We had wage incentives on both sides of the Tasman. In New Zealand, apprenticeship boost, originally $1,000 a month for the first years, $500 a month for the second years. In Australia, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but 50% of the wages were covered for first and second year. So what you saw in Australia was a doubling and then a doubling again between 20 and 2022 in terms of the numbers. So that's the overall trends, and you can see there on the graph we've got the total in training is the blue line, the new entrants is the green line, and the completions is the orange line. But then look what's happened since. What you can see in New Zealand, I'm sorry to say, is a 40% decline in commencements if we compare 2020 with 2025. That is something to do with the dilution or we've got a wage incentive. That's a stimulus policy. You always get a bit of a spike and then you find a new normal. But it's dropping away, and it's dropping away appreciably. In fact, 2024 to 2025 was a 25% drop in commencements. That's got to give us the jitters. That's obviously a combination of factors, economic downturn, but also the role of those kinds of wage incentives and the overall status of the system. And Australia too, although I think the graphs are a little prettier, certainly, I think it's fair to say there's some nervousness there too and a worry about completions and what needs to happen in terms of continuing to support those employers. Now, look, I think that's me. Oh, yes, no. How can I not talk about completion rates? And then it'll be 10 past 11 and I'll never speak again for the rest of the call. 6-year completion rates. Again, I had to do some fiddling here to make sure that the New Zealand and the Australian figures were comparable. New Zealand tends to talk about a 5-year completion rate. Hate to tell you, those on the call, that's 40. We're down to 40% completion over the 5-year figure. When you add another year and go to 6-year completion, we're up to 50, but that's half. I don't think anybody can call that great. And of course, the worst thing is that it's gone down 12% percentage point decline, and that's going back to the 2016 starters and through to the 2020 starters. Yes, Nicola or anybody else, absolutely, the recording and all slides will be made available to everybody that's registered. And as you can see over in Australia, I think it is a much better picture, although I'm sure, again, we'd all love it to be higher, and we're going to talk about the supports and what helps the situation and what the research is saying. But I would have called Australia's apprenticeship 6-year individual completion rate stable to slightly improving. I hope that's not fake news, because that certainly is what the NZVETR stats show. There are a few caveats just for train spotters out there. New Zealand's got an annual stats. Australia's NZVER. I wish we had a Centre for Vocational Education and Research in New Zealand, but that's another story. It puts out quarterly data, so sometimes the full year data washes back, but that's kind of in the weeds. This is a reasonable picture, I would have thought. So anyway, team, that's the state of play. Peter, Gary, before I throw over to you for your presentations, is there anything quickly that you want to just make sure we don't lose on the way through?
Thanks, Joss. No, look, I think you've covered it really well. From a group training perspective, our completion rates are better, but that then links to more mentoring for the host employer and the individual apprentice. And I think there was a question there about slight improvements with completion rates. Does that correlate with more women in trades? My gut answer to that would be yes.
Yeah.
We find the women in trades probably take a little bit longer to commit to the trade, so they're actually thinking about what does it look like a lot harder than probably the males do. And I do think, just anecdotally, that converts to probably better completion rates.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. Anything from you, Peter?
The only thing I'd say about completion rates is the NZVETR, who you referenced there, have done a lot of work on their data collection on completion rates over the last year or two, and then they're getting much better at tracking individuals as they go through the system. So we had a dire completion rate for a long time, and it seems to have been improved because they're getting better at tracking how an individual progresses. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. All right, well, look, I'm going to throw the talking stick over to you, Gary, and as I mentioned at the outset, we know that you've done some great work, particularly with the GAN Australia work around quality apprenticeships, which actually came out of the principles for quality apprenticeships that was adopted by the ILO a few years back. But specifically for today's presentation, the research and some significant maths that you've been doing on return on investment, because of course, for anybody in the sector, how we get that employer to say yes rather than no is definitely telling a compelling story about what's in it for them. So yeah, over to you, Gary.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks for the invitation today. Hopefully everyone can see my screen okay there. And again, happy to share the slides with everyone when we finish. But as Josh mentioned, probably would have been around about 2020, we started talking a little bit about how do we calculate a return on investment. There were a few papers that were done in other countries. I know Germany had a strong paper on it. I think even NCVR had a go at it in Australia. I think one of the problems is that there's so many variables when you're trying to look at a return on investment and giving an exact answer, an exact percentage or figure. But anecdotally, we'd heard from a lot of employers over the last sort of 6 years sort of say, well, the apprentice really isn't valuable to my organisation until they're sort of halfway through the second year into the third year, when they can actually, they're a lot more competent, they can be less supervised and they can actually do more activities. So it was interesting to see how employers anecdotally just sort of looked at that. And then when we put a whole heap of maths around it, what does that sort of look like from there? I want to go to the next slide. There's $1 million question for me. There we go. Sorry. So some of the things we've tried to take into account and really just trying to tell people, okay, if you're going to do this for your own organisation, there are so many variables. So first of all, you've obviously got to identify your costs, training expenses, and that includes on and off the job training, training fees, salaries for supervisors, training materials and equipment, the apprentice wages, other entitlements like superannuation or leave, and then the administration costs, so times and resources spent managing the program. And then how do you then, I guess, measure the performance of your apprenticeship system? So the individual, how are they progressing through their apprenticeship? What productivity gains may the individual able to sort of produce? What's the employer retention rate? So if you're only getting a 50% completion rate of your apprentices, what does that look like for a business over a longer period of time? And then once they're getting near the end of their apprenticeship, are there any real quality improvements within your systems? Is that a really skilled, highly valuable worker that you've produced at the end of it? How do you charge them out for your business along the way? All those sorts of things are very variable, I think, from one business to another. So we try to align our return on investment tool with what are some of the industrial relations systems in Australia? How do we track performance from a training perspective? We have a competency-based completion system. So, in theory, they're 25% complete after the first year, they're 50% complete after the second year, and so on. So trying to bring all of these things into, I guess, one simple calculator for people to use. So when we have a look at it from an employer perspective, as we just talked about, wages, superannuation, insurance, supervision, mentoring, equipment, on and off the job training, whether you've got to pay them while they're off the job. What are the benefits? Does that look like for the employer? With our investment tool, we also looked at it from 4 different perspectives. So not just from the employer, we also wanted to understand what was the return on the investment for the individual apprentice. So initially they may be on lower wages, they may get additional government supports through loans or tools or free training, but what are the benefits for the individuals? Obviously they're being paid, they may not have student debt, they might have higher future earnings in the future, and they may be more employable. If we wanted to understand what putting into this system, so what are their costs? So incentives to employers, maybe wage subsidies for apprentices as well, funding for the training that's being delivered, and they may also support some of the administration costs or regulatory oversight for employers. But what we certainly found was government and the wider community get a far more wide list of benefits. So, obviously reduced unemployment and welfare, they get a tax revenue from skilled employers, they get economic productivity gains, they have a future ready skilled workforce, they've got a community where there's social mobility and inclusion, and apprenticeships are known to support more disadvantaged groups, which Josh has highlighted already through some of the stats. Support for local industries. Obviously, when we think about apprenticeships, we think about the traditional trades like construction, automotive, manufacturing, but even things like childcare, the healthcare system, traineeships in business administration and IT. So there's benefits for a wider group of employers. And then what's the, is that improving the overall economic resilience of a region or a community at a local level or at a wider country level? So there's a lot of things there that you've got to really take into account. The calculator and the paper that goes with it, you can download it and use it. There's a do-it-yourself model where you can plug in all your own individual figures. If you're that way inclined, you can work through that. We also provided 4 examples on the tool. So we provided an automotive apprentice, which in Australia, automotive apprentices, their wages would be on the lower end of the apprenticeship scope. And we picked someone for our case study that was experiencing disadvantage. So they may be long-term unemployed. There may be additional government supports for that individual, for the employer to take someone on that's experiencing disadvantage. The electrical apprentice example, we picked someone that was working on a commercial site. that they were being paid well above the standard award rates for their wages. They had maybe an enterprise bargaining agreement on that site, might have been union run, and everyone's paid a lot higher. The other example we've shown is carpentry. In Australia, if someone finishes their secondary school, which is year 12, they actually get a slightly higher starting wage in their industrial award system. So it's an encouragement for young people to stay at high school and get right through to completion. And then the other option we put forward was a business administration, a 2-year traineeship, standard costs, but a shorter period of time compared to a 4-year apprenticeship. Some of the other assumptions we've made here, and I'm not going to go through all of them in a lot of detail because we'll certainly run out of time, but we worked on the average qualified worker salary in the awards. So for the automotive one, we used the automotive award, we used the vehicle repair services and retail award, we used the level 6, which meant that they were a qualified worker. So that was the supervision costs that we added to the return on investment calculator. Then we looked at the apprentice wage. We looked at the on and the off job costs because you're still paying them a wage when they're going to do their training at school. We added a supervision ratio where they had to be more supervised in their first year. We put 35%, and then it went down to 25%, 15%, and 10% in the 4th year. So less direct supervision as the skills improve over time. And then the productivity, which is really the hard one in all of this. We had a lot of debates over a couple of years. How do we measure apprentice productivity? But we followed the training completion competency-based theory that we have in Australia. So they were 25% productive in the first year, they were 50% productive in the second year, 75% productive in the third year, and 90% productive until they became fully qualified. And then we charged them out at an hourly rate of 2 times their salary at that point in time. So the employer's getting a benefit from that. Financial supports, community benefits, other things we didn't include in the calculator were things like work-related travel, accommodation costs, any additional licensing costs or things that you might need for the apprentice to do on specific jobs. So we left them out, but the calculator does have a do-it-yourself where you can add all of them in. When we look at it here, and I know that's a lot of information to take on one slide, but the graph on the left is probably the most important. So the orange bars represent the employer benefit in a dollar value. The blue bars represent the employer cost. And then the red line looks at a return on investment over the period of time. So you can see certainly in the first year there, this is the automotive apprentice with a disadvantaged young person. So they're getting greater employer support from the government. But you can still see there that their employer costs are around about $72,000 for that first year when you take into account all the things we've discussed. But the employer benefit in that first year is only around $43,000, $44,000. So there's a significant out of cost financial amount there that the employer has to bear in the first year. When you get to the second year there, you can see it's a lot closer in terms of the costs and the benefits. And then you start to get a real return on that investment in the third year and the fourth year. Again, all of these things you can put in different figures and the graphs automatically change for you in the do-it-yourself calculator, and you can print them out and it'll print out all your assumptions. So when we have the second graph, you can see here, this is getting a lot more technical for all the accountants out there. But the turning point, so when does the employer actually start to not lose money on the apprentice? And most of them occurred in the first or second quarters of the second year. So they were just starting to break even on their costs. And that's taking, somewhere between 15 and 18 months. And then they actually achieve a financially break-even point somewhere in the third or the fourth quarter of the third year. So they actually haven't made a cent on that individual apprentice until the third or fourth quarter of the third year. So that's quite a significant investment for an employer to make. Obviously, after that, there's a really good return on investment. And I think this is one of the things when we run programs in Australia, Josh, we have some employers saying, oh, have you got a third or a fourth year apprentice you can give me? Because I think anecdotally, they know financially they're going to be a lot better off in that third and fourth year. Their skills are better, their supervision requirements are less. But when you break it down dollar by dollar, it's quite a significant cost when you look at it that way. And then when we look at it overall, over the 4-year duration of the apprenticeship, the employer costs were around about $270,000. So that's a significant investment that the employer needs to make. The employer benefit over that 4-year period was $350,000. The apprentice benefit with their wages and supports was about $210,000. The community cost, and this is where governments are financially supporting a program, were around about $35,000. And the community benefit was just over $100,000. So when you add up all those things together, again, I think governments invest in the apprenticeship system a lot more upfront. When we looked at some of the key messages, for every dollar that's spent on supporting an apprentice over the 4 years, the employer receives a financial benefit of about $1.40, but that really doesn't kick in until the 3rd and 4th years. When the government spends $1 on the apprenticeship system, they receive a benefit of $4.76. So it's a great investment for governments if you purely just looked at it from a financial perspective. It takes somewhere between 1.6 and 2.6 years to be financially beneficial for the employer to break even. And when you look at it from an individual apprentice perspective, over the 4 years, the individual's earned over $210,000 with no training debt. In Australia, the average number of apprentices that find work in the same trades once they've completed is really high. It's over 93%. So once you get your qualification, you're very employable in the Australian sort of system. Governments, industry, communities all benefit from the apprenticeship system. So, I think if there's more financial support for employees in the early stages, this can help offset the apprentices being more productive and employers taking on more apprentices over time, and then we're going to help meet our skill shortages. We also did an example with group training, and you might be able to scale this up if anyone from the Australian government's listening. If you were able to scale up the GTO network and support an additional 2,000 or 20,000 apprentices, that would have a significant overall net benefit to the community in Australia. So that was some of the key findings in the paper, Josh. And again, people can have a crack at it themselves, and we'd be keen for employers to really have a shot at it and tell us if they're getting similar results to what we've shown.
Thank you, Gary. That's fantastic. I mean, both the ROI work that you've done, but also, the use value for us. And, there's a conversations already popping up in the chat around the cost of rework, etc. But to put your group training hat on there for a second, I know we've got quite a few people on the line from, EDCO, which is part of Skills Group, also ATT, I think, is here, perhaps others. If everybody wants a 3rd year, but, you've got to have a 1st and a 2nd year to create a 3rd year, which is part of that argument for that upfront support, right? How do you see, can you expand because for GTO, right, the ability there, given that the way the workforces move around is that your 4-year apprentice is likely not to finish with the same employer that they start with, right? So, if people are out there feeling like I'm just doing all the 1st years, that's, everybody wants the benefit of the productive worker that's at the latter end of the process, right? So how do you see group training kind of really stepping into that space?
Yeah, these are some of the conversations we've tried to have with some government officials in Australia. Like I think you could look at a model where the GTO provides more upfront off-the-job training and support. So they're getting through the formal qualification skills earlier. They're doing a bigger chunk of that in the first maybe 18 months. And then the GTO could make sure that they're being rotated around so they're getting a well-rounded, qualified, skilled worker over that first 18 months. So they're not all just working on a very minute sort of part of the skill set that they require at the end of it. And then you might be able to do a bit of a catch and release. The GTOs could work on them for the first few years, and then they could be released to employers later on in the system. So, they're models that we'd be keen to explore a little bit further and potentially pilot. I think once you get an apprentice through the first 18 months, their chances of completion rate are also far much higher than they tend to drop out in the first 12 to 18 months because they're not well supported, or it wasn't really for them, so that they want to do something different. So I think there's some additional benefits you could get to do in something like that.
If they've been hosted with a handful of employers, they might have found one that is more of a fit for them, whether that's the scope of work or just the culture or all of those kinds of things too. That's great. Gary, thank you again for the presentation. I will reveal to the audience that one former New Zealand Minister of Tertiary Education described Gary as the Energizer Bunny of Australia's vocational education system, and I think you saw it just a little bit of that then. And that also, I think, segues nicely, Peter, to some of the things that you've found with the employer perspectives research, and that again, that support there around the front end of the apprenticeship and the kinds of models, and actually the 4-year thing. I wonder if we might touch on durations, because I think, I know that you've been involved in several states in Australia are looking at dual apprenticeship type models and some innovations in that space. So, Peter, without further ado, handing over to you.
Thanks, Josh. And we might come to that later on in the webinar, but I'll just kick off by talking about the survey that we did, and just a little bit about Australian Industry Group. For those who don't know, we're an employer association, so a membership organisation. Companies join us for various reasons, and we have members in a lot of different industry sectors. We're traditionally manufacturing, but we've got members now right across the economy in construction, transport, the care sector. It's quite broad what our membership is, but so that's sort of where we're coming from. We're an employers group. The background to this report was the incoming Labor government back in, I think it was 2023, they commissioned a strategic review of the apprenticeship incentive system. And that went on for about 12 months, and their final report came out at the end of 2024. And there was some recommendations in that review that we were a little bit concerned about, one of which was removing incentives completely for companies with more than 200 employees. We felt that for us to, before we could mount any objections or whatever, we really needed to know better what our members thought about the apprenticeship system and how they used incentives and all of that. And that was really the catalyst for us commissioning this review. So that's going on. So we went out to a lot of different companies. We had 138 responses, which is not too bad, but we augmented that by having a lot of deep dive interviews with individual companies to get their detailed response to apprenticeships. And it was also underpinned by some existing research that we'd already done. The companies were spread right across, so we had a fair number of small, large and medium companies that responded, and across the economy as well. So 41% of manufacturing employers responded, which sort of reflects our membership, but 28% in construction and a fairly high proportion in the services sector as well. So a fairly broad response to our survey questions. So these are the key messages that came out of this survey. And I guess the key one of this is that the cost and the complexity of employing apprentices and trainees is increasing, and employer satisfaction with the system is decreasing. And and this was a response before much had changed with the incentive system. We found that the apprenticeship system is currently not producing sufficient numbers of skilled people to meet Australia's skills needs. Financial incentives don't solely drive decision-making for employers, but they do represent an important part of the overall economic decision. And really, to grow apprenticeships and traineeships, the focus should be on ensuring the system is viable for new employers and for existing employers to maximise the apprenticeships and traineeships they provide. A key thing for all of this is, without an employer, there is no apprentice or no trainee. All of the apprenticeship and traineeships commence with an employer. So it's got to be viable for an employer to participate. Some of the key findings were that more than 8 in 10 employers of apprentices and trainees identified them as important or very important to their business. So they're certainly highly valued by employers. We found that 96% of employers face barriers when hiring apprentices and trainees, and I'll get to those in a minute. And also around half of them said that their employment of apprentices and trainees would reduce if they no longer received financial incentives. And that was across the board, across all different sectors and size of business. So it should be clear that the employer experience is underpinned by the economic equation. And Gary's just been talking about the return on investment. At the heart of all of this, there's an economic decision about whether it is viable employing an apprentice. And some of the things that they need to consider are some of the things that Gary has been talking about: wages, on-the-job training and losing apprentices to on-the-job training, the cost of supervision, the cost of supporting the apprentice, the reduced productivity, especially in that first and second year, the administration and coordination of apprenticeships can be quite complex. And then the other thing is non-completions as well. So we've already looked a little bit at non-completions. It's what, 58%. There's a lot of apprentices that don't complete. So all of these make up the equation for the employer and influence their decision about whether they're going to employ an apprentice or not. We asked companies what factors were the major barriers to hiring an apprentice. And by far the largest one was the difficulty in finding suitable candidates. And again, that was across the board. We found that the traditional trades really struggle to find good candidates for apprenticeships, apart from a couple of selected trades. The electrical field is quite popular, and they generally don't have trouble finding a good candidate. The same with plumbing. But if we have a lot of manufacturing companies, and they employ engineering trades and metal trades, and they really struggle to find good candidates. So that's a big barrier for them employing. And certainly I spoke to some companies who said they'd given up taking on apprentices just because they can't find good candidates. The next major barrier was the difficulty in supervising and training on the job. And that's not just about dedicating a person to looking after that apprentice. But we had a few companies tell me that they often lose their apprentice supervisors to the big infrastructure projects. So, for example, in Queensland, they're now gearing up for the Olympics in 2032. There's a lot of infrastructure projects going on in Brisbane. Companies are losing all of their experienced tradespeople who would normally supervise apprentices to those projects because they pay so much more. And that then puts pressure on them to be able to supervise apprentices in the workplace. Had one of our larger companies, they take on about 40 apprentices each year, and they're taking on 20 next year purely because they don't have people to supervise them. So that's an interesting one, that one. The next one was the costs are too high. It's not cost effective to employ apprentices. We've already spoken about that. Available training not to the right standard. So that's really about whether the training providers are able to provide good quality training. We've had big issues about trade teachers. The shortage of trade teachers in Australia is probably the same issue in Tasmania. There's a real shortage of tradespeople, so that affects the available training that's available. And that final one, the administration and the regulation, is becoming too burdensome for employers. And I know some of the larger companies that employ large numbers of apprentices, they have full-time staff just dedicated to completing all of that regulation. I'm sure Gary could talk about group training people. Each group training organisation would have people full-time working on all of that. We ask companies how they use the financial incentives that they currently get for apprentices and trainees. For most of them, it's about using that incentive to offset the costs associated with employing apprentices and trainees. So that might contribute to their wages. Often it contributes to the training fees. For some apprenticeships, there might be a cost of, say, $5,000 to the employer to enrol with a training provider to complete a qualification. So those incentives are used just to contribute to that. Some of the others use that money, and it's more some of the larger companies, again, they use that incentive money to fund the employment of an apprentice master or an apprentice supervisor, to fund other training programs. There are some companies that don't just put people through a standard apprenticeship, but they'll provide them with additional training as they progress as well. So they'll come out as a more highly skilled technician, and that incentives money is contributing to that. Others use it to fund mentoring programs or to fund internal rotation schemes. So we found it was more the other small business would use it to offset costs, use the incentives, but the larger ones would fund those additional programs to support their apprentices. And Gary mentioned earlier that group training has better completion rates than most employers. The other side of that too is that large companies have much better completion rates than small business. And part of that is because they use that incentives to fund those sorts of programs to support their apprentices. We asked companies what would be the impact upon their employment of apprentices and trainees if the incentives were no longer available. And as I mentioned, about half said that it would affect their employment of apprentices. So you can see there, what's that, 51% said that they would see reduced employment. So I've spoken to a lot of companies just recently because we have had an announcement, and that's reflected in just the conversations I've been having too. This is the last chart that I was going to show. When I mentioned before that the strategic review recommended that larger companies employing 200 should no longer receive incentives. That's now been a budget decision. So when the May budget was announced by the Commonwealth Government, that was in there, and that's going to come in from the 1st of January 2027. So you can see on that chart there that there was a big spike during the pandemic, and that related to those wage incentives, which were very generous, probably overly generous, but numbers have been going down steadily since then. And you can see for traineeships, it's dropped below where it was before the pandemic, and apprenticeships is still heading downwards. And this was before, excuse me, this is before the changes to incentives take place at the end of this year. So it'll be interesting to see where we go, but the numbers are not looking good. I think that's all from me.
Peter, thank you very much. I mean, that's, gosh, you know, some of the acronyms are different, but a lot of the issues and the dynamics you're describing are certainly really familiar. I've got a couple of thoughts, but actually I've also had half an eye on the chat, and there's an excellent exchange going on in there. And just one of your key findings, of course, in fact, it was, you know, the outstanding finding was difficulty finding suitable candidates. So there's been a couple of people thumbs up what makes a good candidate, good or suitable. So what would you say about that? What's a suitable candidate? What's a good candidate? Is that sort of in the eye of each employer, or are there a set of things that, you know, are actually in common there?
For some employers, it's difficulty in finding any candidate. I know that some of the trades that our members are in, sheet metal is one, foundry is another. They can't find any candidates at all. But it's. I mean, most employers will tell you it's just about the attitude. If somebody is interested in the work and willing to learn, that is all they'll need. But it's very difficult to find. Well, not very difficult. It depends on the industry sector, but a lot of employers find it very difficult to find those people with a good attitude to learning.
And actually, maybe this is one where we can go for both of you, because you've also talked about the fact, and, you know, in fact, this latest budget decision would suggest that, oh, well, big employers, you've got the infrastructure, so you don't need the incentives, or your completion rates are better, or you can use the money on other things again because you've got that training infrastructure. But, you know, Gary, we talk a lot about the role of intermediaries, what support networks or, you know, our training providers do to support the situation, or to, if you like, take some of the pressure off the in-company piece of the training. And then going right back to the beginning, of course, we need to remember that it's only a minority of employers that are offering these traineeship and apprenticeship opportunities within any one industry. So, you know, how, I guess this goes really to that completions thing, you know, from both of you, where do you sort of see the key system shifts or things that need to happen to, you know, see both the commencements come back up and the completions improve?
I'm happy to start, Pete. Yeah, look, we did a lot of work before COVID on a program called multi-industry pre-apprenticeships, where the premise was we don't think a lot of young people actually know what jobs are available and what qualifications they need to go. So they actually don't know the pathway. We find in Australia about 80% of our inquiries are about the electrical apprenticeship. So trying to find candidates for the electrical industry is not a problem, but trying to find candidates for every other industry is a real challenge. And that's probably driven by career advisors and parents and the media saying that that's a sustainable career and it's a well-paying career. I think we've got to give young people a chance to explore what they're good at. What does the job look like? Where am I heading in my career pathway? What does this industry look like over the next 10, 15 years before we sign them up to a 4-year university degree or a 4-year apprenticeship? Because I think if you get better informed choices, you'll get better completion rates. We found over 55% of the youth changed their mind in the multi-industry pre-app, where they got a chance to, they wanted to work in the construction industry, but they didn't know if they wanted to be a bricklayer, carpenter, or an electrician. They were open to multiple pathways. But once they found the good employer, they found their passion, I guess, is the word we would use, completion rates would follow. But I don't think putting people straight into a 4-year degree or a 4-year apprenticeship is helping anyone with completion rates.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
I'd agree. I'd agree with that. I think those pre-apprenticeship type programs are really valuable. Though I don't know the data on that, Gary, whether they have a better completion rate than those that haven't done it, but they're certainly very. They've looked at the industry before they go into it, and employers do love someone who's understands a little bit about the work before they commence. I'm sure they would have a better completion rate. The other thing about good candidates is careers teachers and talking to students while they're still at school. It's been a long-standing thing in Australia that careers teachers are more focused on university entrance than going into trades or other technical occupations. So they're more than happy to talk to students about what score they need to get into a university to do a class, but don't know a lot about the trades and don't do much in terms of promoting it. And this is something we've been talking about for a very long time, but I haven't seen much change in that one. As far as completions go, excuse me, it is small business that has the lower completion rates, and I think that the two main reasons for that are they're not as good as recruiting. They don't run HR departments. Often it's one small trader who's employing an apprentice carpenter or something like that, and it's the neighbour's kid or something like that. There's no recruitment process to make sure that this person is suited to the industry, that is going to be suited to the company, and so if they're poorly matched at the start, they're not going to last. And they'll get into the apprenticeship, they'll do it for 6 months, and then they'll realise that I don't like the work, or I can't work with this person, or whatever it might be. So I think if there's better recruitment practices by small business, that would help. And we've been talking about that for a long time. But the other thing too is a lot of those small companies don't really understand their responsibilities towards an apprentice. Even though they will sign documents to say, this is what I've got to do as the employer, I don't know that they read it all that closely. They don't understand that they've got to give them, work with that's relevant to their trade, where interesting work relevant to their trade. They've got to release them to go to school to do their training. There are obligations on the employer. And I don't think a lot of the smaller ones understand what those obligations are. I think if there's better professional development of supervisors, it would improve their retention once they've commenced their apprenticeship.
Yeah. Thanks both. I've been travelling my eye up and down the conversation in the chat, and I think there's a number of ways we could jump. Probably the thing that I'm seeing that's bringing it together is something along the lines of, what about our historical assumptions? Level 4, parity of esteem, 4 years. Why? Isn't it time for competency-based? I mean, on paper, both our countries have been competency-based, or in New Zealand's case, since 1992, but the time served underpinnings, and as I think it was Andre pointed out, the craft is moving faster than the artisan because of technology change. So all of that does go to that granularity and lifelong learning. And Craig Robertson, welcome, a keynote from the Research Forum last year and Chief of the Victorian Skills Authority. How wonderful that you're here. So what do you think? I mean, I mentioned, Peter, there is that dual apprenticeship piece. Could you describe perhaps for us what's going on there, maybe multi-industry or some of the things people are trying out that, might, as I say, we don't need to do it the way we've always done it. And I really appreciate the thinking that's going into the chat here too.
We get a lot of feedback from companies that the standard trade is not really cutting it these days because of increased technology. They really need somebody at a slightly higher level than that Certificate 3 tradesperson that they've been getting for a long time. So we've been looking at dual programs that will still provide that underpinning trade skill, because that's still important for every employer. But they need to be developed a little bit better. They need to understand the impact of technologies, some of the digital technologies that come into a lot of these occupations now. Especially we're seeing this in the engineering area. So for example, we've developed a program with RMIT in Victoria where the apprentices will end up completing a Bachelor of Engineering, but they will complete that Bachelor of Engineering, that'll be done over 5 years, via a vet level qualification. So they'll enrol in an advanced diploma of engineering. They'll do 2 years of vet training, and then they will progress onto a degree.
Yeah.
And so they're the sorts of programs that we're seeing that we think will be useful, but still noting that the standard trade skills are still really important.
Yeah.
I know TAFE New South Wales has developed a program which is there to augment someone who's completed a mechanical engineering apprenticeship. They can then undertake all of these micro credentials and potentially end up with an associate degree in digital technology. So those sorts of programs, I think, are the future.
Yeah.
Just on the competency-based completion of apprenticeships, it came in Australia several years ago now, but the way a lot of it works is the training providers want to complete apprentices within 3 years. So they put them through their training program, and after 3 years, they've completed their certificate 3 in whatever it might be, and then they want to get them signed off. But the employers are not necessarily happy with that. And we hear of situations where training provider finishes a qualification, sends the paperwork into the state government writes to the apprentice and the employer saying, okay, it looks like you've completed, sign here and we'll wrap it all up. And I hear from companies that, well, no, they might have completed a qualification, but they're not competent. They still can't do the job in the workplace. So there's got to be better communications there.
Gary, we're quickly running out of time, so anything you like, a final burning reflection from you on the hour that we've had.
Yeah, look, I think there's a real opportunity for us to fast track some qualifications, dual qualifications with university. Those sorts of things are starting to be piloted in Australia. There's one that absolutely stands out from my perspective, and I'd call it like the finishing trades, where you put plastering, concreting, tiling, painting, flooring all together in one, and waterproofing all into one qual. We have very few apprenticeships in any one of those individual trades anymore. The trades are moving away from using the apprenticeship system in that space. So how do we actually start to remodel what employers are looking for in that space? The plumbing and electrical, the ones that are heavily unionised, I think they're a little bit hard to crack. But again, new technology, how's digital, the world of the internet, how is that playing into the space of a qualified worker going forward? We need to move forward with the competencies. Yeah,
cool. Hey, look, please hit your reaction buttons and thank Peter Canavan and Gary Workman for fabulous contributions. And, just the chat alone is a great proof point for us at Skills that these are great. Thank you very much. We're really pleased to bring you this masterclass series for the New Zealand Vocational Education and Training Research Forum. And just to segue around what vocational and higher education might do, I'd just like to make a few announcements. One is that the New Zealand Vocational Education and Training Research Forum will be returning in 2026. Save the date is October 12 and 13. Save the venue is Te Papa in Wellington. And I'm also really delighted to announce today that BCITO will be joining with us again to co-host the event between Skills Group and BCITO. We'll be out there looking for more supporters and sponsors as well. But in the meantime, as you're part of this network and the community that this is all about, we do look forward to welcoming many of you at the big forum, and also would like to drag a few Aussies over the Tasman for that as well. So look, without any further ado, I think that's all of my housekeeping messages. Any queries that you've got, there is an email address. It's nzvetrf@skillsgroup.org. That's skills-group.org. If you have any questions now, otherwise, recording slides, and stay tuned for the formal announcements and a call for abstracts for the forum. Thank you again very much to my guests and to all of you for taking the time to be here. Cheers. Hey, Kona.
Thank you.